everyone, and welcome back to my channel where we sometimes talk about thrillers on Thursdays. And it has been a while since I filmed, so I only have time to ever film on weekends, and I've been gone the past 3, so I'm trying to film multiple this weekend so I can get back into the swing of things. But I'm very excited to film today's video because it's been a video I've been wanting to film for the past month, and that is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones and The Final Girls Support Group by Grady Hendrix. And I'm sure you can, well, maybe you can't tell by the titles, but if you're familiar with both books, they center around the trope in the horror genre of the final girl. And I coincidentally happened to read both back to back and had wildly different reading experiences with both, so I thought it'd be really fun to come and talk about both and compare them a little bit. As usual, I will not have any spoilers for either book, and if you do want to get notified whenever I post a video, feel free to click that notification bell down below. Also, I scrolled for a while because at first I was gonna have I didn't want a big black TV screen. I'm filming at night, so this isn't my normal filming setup, and by night I mean 6:24 p.m. This is another reason it's been harder to film lately, but I wanted to try and find some sort of dark, creepy Christmas background, so hopefully you all enjoy this one. But I'm going to talk about My Heart is a Chainsaw, then I will talk about My Final Girl Support Group, and then at the end of talking about both, I will give my final ratings. A part of the reason I'm excited to film this is to talk about these books, but it's also so I can do my new rating scale that you've seen if I did a couple videos back, because I'm still really obsessed with it. But first, let's go ahead and talk about My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. And I have to say, this was receiving this book and all the items that came with it. I'll insert an image here of the video where I got all of it. It was so kindly sent to me, that came with a bunch of really cool sort of fake newspapers and postcards for the area that this book took place. And since I was already anticipating reading this book, I just felt really grateful and excited to get all of that. But I promise that did not bias my review. So for a quick summary, our protagonist is Jade Daniels, and she is a half Indian outcast with an abusive father and absent mother, and she lives in kind of her own world, and the way she copes with the not great things that she's dealing with is by obsessing about slasher movies. And Indian Lake, the place she lives, is being gentrified very, very quickly with this new neighborhood, and she is convinced that a slasher is taking place and that there's going to be this sort of final all-out killing spree that you would see in a slasher movie. And I have to say, my experience reading this was pretty mixed, because when I started reading it, I was reading the physical copy that I was kindly sent, and I was really enjoying it. And it's very hard to articulate and pinpoint exactly what it was, but sometimes I would feel as if I was missing even just one line or one word, and then suddenly I was a little bit lost. And it's rare that I have that reading experience. And it's the first time I've read a book by Stephen Graham Jones. But then I started reading some reviews of this book as well as his other very popular book, The Only Good Indians. And some people were saying he has a very unique writing style. Some were describing it a little bit stream of consciousness. And that made me think maybe I would prefer it as an audiobook. And when I switched to the audiobook format, it gripped me so much more, I think. But now let's go ahead and get into the prose. So I have to say, I adored Jade, and I knew the vague premise of this book, but somehow I didn't know going into it that our protagonist was going to be 17 and be a teenager. And for whatever reason, I tend to not like reading books where the protagonist is that young, but I still adored Jade. I found her equally funny as well as heartbreaking, and all of the side characters, especially her teachers, the cops, they felt very... In some cases, you despise some of these characters and you want them to die. In other cases, they were incredibly funny, and I could see them pulled straight out of an 80s horror movie. So every single side character, down to like the little, the secretary at the police station, I found just really fascinating and interesting. And I do have to say, slashers, as excited as I was and anticipated as I was for this book, slashers are not my favorite horror genre in general. But this book made me much more interested in them, and it reminded me a little bit of 12 Nights at Rotterhouse in the sense that there was so much great trivia, and I added movies like, for example, Bay of Blood that I'd never even heard of, and now I'm so excited to go ahead and watch. And some of my favorite pieces of this were when Jade is writing these essays to her professor. And of course, she's writing them about slashers. And although these are, little snippets written by a teenager in high school, they are so interesting. And if you're a fan of horror, you're going to love them. And she even in them often talks about the trope of the final girl. And I thought that was handled so well in this book. A character arrives very early on in the book and she's very wealthy. She comes from the family that's moving into the area and she's very pretty and perfect and sort of when you think of a final girl, she has a lot of those characteristics. So when she suddenly appears, Jade is convinced again because she thinks this huge slasher ending is going to happen in this town, that this new girl must be the final girl, right? She's the new girl. She's kind of like Miss Perfect, but also really strong and kind. And she is just convinced that you need those qualities to be a final girl. And she views herself as too damaged and with other not great characteristics that just make her not be able to be the final girl in her own mind. And I did want to read a quote, and I'll link this article down below. It's an interview of Stephen Graham Jones by Tanara Dew, who wrote The Good House, which is one of my other favorite horror novels. But when she asked him what he likes about horror, this is what he said. But he says, what I liked about horror is that it makes my world larger. It puts tentacles there. It puts teeth in the shadows. It puts scary things. But where there's a tentacle reaching through a door you cracked open, there can also be like a rainbow or an angel or a unicorn or something good, So that's what horror gives me. It makes my world bigger. And I cannot stop thinking about that quote and so many other quotes in the article. He also really gets into why marginalized groups might really gravitate towards horror. So again, really good read. In terms of cons, I really do not have many. As I said at the beginning, although I don't know if I would even classify this as a con, me personally, I preferred it as an audiobook to a physical book, but I really do think what it's going to come down for whether or not you enjoy this book is really whether or not you enjoy his writing style, because if you're a fan of horror, it's just hard for me, unless you're not a fan of his writing style, to really not enjoy this book. And again, I'm going to talk about ratings for both at the very end. So now we're going to switch into the Final Girl support group by Grady Hendrix. And I was a huge fan of the Southern Book Club's Guide for Slaying Vampires. That was one of my favorite books that I read in 2020. And it's the only book I've read by Grady Hendrix. So my only experience of reading him is loving his book. So I came into this with really high expectations. And this is about Lynette, and she is a real life final girl who survived a massacre 22 years ago. And for more than a decade, she's been meeting with 5 other actual final girls. And of course, as the title says, a support group. And when one of them goes missing at a meeting, her worst fears are realized that someone she thinks is out targeting and killing them one by one. And again, because I loved the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires so much, when I hear that summary, and even as I say it out loud right now, I think to myself, how is it possible that I would not love this? How could this, it sounds so exciting, how could it possibly be boring? And with that, let's shift into the cons, because somehow, in my opinion, he managed to take such a fascinating premise and make it horrifically boring. And a lot happens in the book. I saw some people saying that they thought not much happened, but I think that just gets down to how he delivered the story, because there are a good amount of really action-packed scenes. And I also can really enjoy a very slow-paced book. So when I say this is boring, that's not saying that I in general don't enjoy a very character-driven, slower-paced book. I was not really invested in this book until maybe 80% of the way through. I had the urge, although I did read it, but I had the urge to just be skipping through pages. I just got scared for a moment because that's a mirror and I'm not wearing pants. For a second, you might be able to see me. Okay, we're good. I despised every character, and I understand, and I kept having to remind myself, yes, all of these final girls have been through horrible tragedies, but it's such a common trope that when you're reading a thriller or a horror novel or a mystery novel, right, we're used to, like, even though this book isn't about it, we're used to like the jaded, angry female detective who's had a rough life, and because of that, she's got a chip on her shoulder. But you can still do and write characters who have had horrible things happen to them, who are snarky and angry, and make them interesting and make you still care about them. If any of these final girls died at any point, except maybe one, I would not have cared. It's not a great sign of a book when your only character you're rooting for is someone's pet plant. Fine was adorable and I was worried about him, but no one else. But somehow all of these characters were simultaneously irritating and also boring. And with that, let's go ahead and shift into pros. So my only really pro that I have for this book is, if you're a fan of horror, and I don't know why you'd be watching this channel if you're not, but if you're whatever, not what I'm about to say might sound strange, but obviously sometimes we like reading really interesting, well done graphic imagery that really sticks in your mind. And I will say that I think it's maybe 70% of the way into the book when you finally find out what happened to Lynette when she was a teenager and what makes her a final girl It is horrifying. Some of the imagery stuck with me, and I'm not going to be able to explain it without spoiling anything, so I won't, but I will just say some of the take and interpretations for why she and other members of the group don't view her as a true sort of final girl, I did find that interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about both books, and my ratings will probably not be a surprise. So I'm going to go ahead and give the Final Girl support group 2 out of 5 creepy candles. And I'm not surprisingly going to give My Heart is a Chainsaw 5 out of 5 creepy candles. And again, I really think Final Girl support group is going to come down to how you feel about the characters for whether or not you enjoy it. And I think My Heart is a Chainsaw is going to really come down to whether or not you really enjoy his writing style. So please let me know, what did you think about both of these books? Again, I've filmed a couple videos today. I filmed sort of a bookshelf tour type video, so that will be up next Thursday. And then I'm thinking the Thursday after that, we might already be ready for favorite and least favorite books of 2021. And because I haven't had time to film over the last month, I think I am gonna have a good amount of books for you all to hear about that maybe you haven't heard me talk about throughout the year. So again, I hope you all are doing well and staying safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.